This is the second part of a 4-part series on the history of Nintendo at E3. If you haven't seen part 1, which chronicles the first years of E3, you can click here to check that out. Now, however, we look at the lowest point in Nintendo's history, and its fight for relevance against rising competitors following the turn of the millennium. The big news leading up to E3 2001 was that Sega had discontinued the failing Dreamcast in January of 2001 and was officially out of the hardware business. It would instead become a third-party developer. The scramble for Sega was on, and it turned out that Nintendo would have another gaming icon to add to its lineup, Sonic the Hedgehog. A port of the Dreamcast game Sonic Adventures 2 to the GameCube would be the first of many Sonic games to be released for a Nintendo platform. But all eyes were on new console hardware in 2001, and Nintendo came prepared. The GameCube was now ready to be shown off, and they brought it out firing on all cylinders. It wasn't, of course, the first time people had seen the GameCube. Nintendo Space World, or Shoshinkai, had been held late the previous year in Japan and showcased a number of games for it. At E3, Shigeru Miyamoto showed off the wireless Wavebird controller by playing a game from halfway across the hall, to great audience reaction. Nintendo treated E3 attendees to a plethora of upcoming GameCube games. The Smash Bros. Franchise also came back with the series-defining Smash Bros. Melee. The game would go on to be a huge success, and it is still regularly played in tournaments around the world today. The unique and clever gameplay of Pikmin was also drawing attention on the show floor. The game, designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, would become a critical and commercial success. Luigi's Mansion was also shown off ahead of its imminent release, and an early version of Star Fox Adventures could be seen. Mario Kart Double Dash was featured in a demo clip, although it was far from complete. Metroid Prime was shown in a video, but it received mixed reactions for its first-person perspective. Despite the tepid early reaction, it would go on to be one of the GameCube's most celebrated games. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader headlined the press conference, showing off some truly stunning graphics and hinting at the capabilities of the new system. Nintendo showed off a few games that would never see play on their consoles. Donkey Kong Racing would eventually be cancelled. So too would be Cameo Elements of Power, but the game was not permanently dead. It would later be resurrected for the Xbox 360 and released in 2005. Not forgetting about their handhelds, Nintendo showcased the Game Boy Advance, which would launch later that year. The hot titles for the system included Advance Wars, Super Mario Advance, Mario Kart, and Golden Sun. Nintendo also talked about the connectivity between the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, which would open up new ways to play. There was also a bit of levity at the Nintendo Q&A session. The very first question was asked in Japanese by a writer for fan site Nintendojo. Unfortunately, the writer's Japanese was so terrible that none of the Nintendo executives could understand the question, much to the audience's amusement. Overall, Nintendo had a good E3 in 2001. The problem was, so did Sony and Microsoft. Microsoft announced that their own console, the Xbox, would launch at the same time as the GameCube. Halo was their standout launch title, and video game icon Peter Molyneux would be creating a groundbreaking RPG for the system. That RPG would later become Fable. Sony, meanwhile, continued to ride high. The PlayStation 2 was doing very well in all markets, and at E3 they had exclusives in Final Fantasy X, Jak and Daxter, Twisted Metal Black, and the much-hyped and almost finished Metal Gear Solid 2. Devil May Cry, another PS2 exclusive, was also turning heads at the show. In E3 2002, it was clear that the GameCube was not performing as well as Nintendo had hoped. Its overall sales were on par with the Xbox, a new console entrant, and well behind the PlayStation 2. Part of the problem was that the game lineup remained small, with few major Nintendo franchise titles being released in the GameCube's first year. Super Smash Bros. Melee had sold well, and Luigi's Mansion was a moderate success, but even Pikmin, which was critically acclaimed, was not moving quickly at retail. Sony considered itself so far ahead that it opened its press conference by declaring the console wars over. At the time, it appeared that they were right. Nintendo's market share had fallen to a sliver of what it had been in the Super Nintendo era. Now, both Sony and Microsoft were pushing online functionality. Xbox was talking up Xbox Live, while Sony had a new network adapter. Nintendo hadn't yet addressed the online gaming world. Instead, their E3 2002 focused on games as they tried to convince Nintendo fans that major titles were on the way. Metroid Prime was back in a much bigger way, letting fans see more of how the 2D side-scroller would transition into first-person 3D. The next Mario installment, Super Mario Sunshine, was also demoed. It was announced that it would be released later that year. The new title looked to bring interesting new water mechanics to the Mario world. Nintendo had hopes that a new Mario title would reinvigorate sales of the GameCube. Fans also got to see some of the next F-Zero game, as well as more of Star Fox Adventures. The popular series Mario Party would also see its fourth iteration for the GameCube. One title getting a fair bit of attention was The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures. The 4-player GameCube game would use the Game Boy Advance's connectivity to allow the handhelds to be used as controllers for the game. Some content would appear on the Game Boy Advance screen and some on the main screen. But what was perhaps Nintendo's biggest game received a somewhat less than wonderful reaction. Zelda fans were not happy with what they had seen of the new Zelda core title, now called Wind Waker, from the Nintendo Space World event in Japan later the previous year. The media had expected a more mature-looking game based on earlier tech demos, and when the childish, cel-shaded graphics were revealed, the media and fans were not impressed. At E3, the game was demoed, but the visual design hadn't changed, leading to some negative coverage. Attendees to the Zelda demo also briefly got to see the darker side of Miyamoto. He became clearly angry after a bug prevented him from progressing during a gameplay demo. On the Game Boy Advance side of things, Golden Sun Lost Ages had a playable demo on the show floor. There was also another new Metroid game. In contrast to the first-person Metroid Prime, the Game Boy Advance would get more traditional Metroid game in Metroid 4, which would be called Metroid Fusion. Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Advance 3 would also return Mario to his traditional SNES stylings. A small but interesting addition to Nintendo's booth was the introduction of an arcade system. Called the Triforce, it had been developed by Nintendo, Sega, and Namco together. While the arcade technology would go on to be used in arcades on both sides of the Pacific, the fact that 3 companies were working together hinted at future collaborations as well. Despite the bevy of games shown by Nintendo at E3 2002, it was clear the company needed to reverse its fortunes. This E3 represented their last real attempt to make the GameCube relevant within that generation of consoles. If it failed to do so, it would be a long wait until the next piece of hardware. But if it came to that, Nintendo hoped they had the man for the job. Just before E3, the company had appointed a new president, and his name was Satoru Iwata. Buoyed by several major releases, the GameCube fared better between 2002 and 2003, but not by much. The Xbox was still selling just about as well, and the GameCube's lineup of games, while slowly growing, was well behind Nintendo's primary competitors. Arguably Nintendo's biggest release, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, had come out just a couple of months prior, but its sales weren't living up to expectations. Mario Sunshine and Metroid Prime had done very well both critically and commercially, but the 2 games weren't enough to make the GameCube a success, despite leading to a bump in sales. Nintendo had found that its fans were demanding more and faster, and with a lack of third-party support, the company simply couldn't meet the demand. The one bit of good news was that the newly released Game Boy Advance SP, with its fold-out design, had sold very well over the previous year. However, that served only to continue Nintendo's leadership in the, until now, nearly uncontested handheld market. It did nothing to help its primary console business. And to make matters worse, Sony showed up with a surprise announcement. In their press conference right before Nintendo's, they announced they were making their own handheld device, the PlayStation Portable. And it looked good. It had graphical capabilities well beyond anything the Game Boy Advance could muster. Sony was taking aim at Nintendo's last bastion of dominance. No one was more shocked than the Nintendo executives, who had nothing to counter Sony's announcement. Nintendo's E3 press conference turned out to be a disaster. Nintendo was spent for major releases to announce, and they were now relying on their secondary franchises. Needless to say, these did not go over well. Their main feature at the press conference was Pac-Man Versus, a game that utilized the GameCube's connectivity with the Game Boy Advance to allow up to 4 players to play Pac-Man. The conference was so disappointing that it spawned its own meme in the form of a picture of some incredibly bored attendees from gaming site IGN, dubbed the Reaction Guys. While Microsoft was showing off online multiplayer for Halo 2 and Sony was touting its own online features, Nintendo was focusing on the GameCube to Game Boy Advance connectivity. Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures was on hand again, as was the new Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. While these would prove to be perfectly adequate gaming experiences, the requirements to have multiple devices and to buy link cables came across as forced and gimmicky. While some of the other games on hand looked good, they failed to arouse much excitement. These included the upcoming F-Zero GX, as well as Star Fox Armada, which would later be renamed Star Fox Assault. The playable demo of Mario Kart Double Dash was on hand, and received mixed reactions for its comparative slow pace. Pikmin 2 looked to largely revisit the gameplay of the first game and also received a somewhat tepid response. Nintendo did have a win in scoring a handful of third-party titles. Capcom was showing off the impressive Beautiful Joe, which was to be a GameCube exclusive. Surprisingly, Resident Evil 4 would also be a GameCube exclusive, although it would eventually see releases elsewhere. The early gameplay of Resident Evil 4 showed at E3 2003 would all end up scrapped when Capcom overhauled its development. With its more action-oriented gameplay than its predecessors, it would ultimately become one of the GameCube's most memorable games. The remake of Konami's Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes also showed quite a bit of promise on the GameCube. Finally, Ubisoft's Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time proved that multi-platform games could look great on the GameCube. On the Game Boy Advance side of things, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga was seen for the first time. The humorous RPG would prove a fan favorite and go on a great critical success. Metroid Zero Mission was shown in video format, continuing the great Game Boy Advance Metroid line from the previous year's popular Metroid Fusion. Advance Wars 2 and a port of Super Mario Bros. 3 rounded out the lineup. While Nintendo had a number of solid games at the show, many wouldn't be released within a year, and none of the imminent releases truly captured the attention of the media or gamers. E3 2003 would go down as Nintendo's worst. The company didn't merely need a new direction, it needed a revolution.
My name is Reggie, I'm about kicking ass, I'm about taking names, and we're about making games.
With that famous introduction to Nintendo's E3 press conference, Nintendo set a very different tone for E3 2004 than they had the previous year. The so-called Revolution had begun. Nintendo, it turned out, had reasons to make fans have faith again. Nintendo showed off some great-looking gameplay of Metroid Prime 2, Echoes, and Resident Evil 4. By now, the latter game had been reinvented, and what fans saw looked promising. It was a wholly new direction for the legendary series, but it proved to be the right one. The media expected 2005 to be a big year for new console hardware, but that didn't mean Nintendo didn't have some hardware up its sleeve. Satoru Iwata came in the pre-show press conference holding up the Nintendo DS, the next generation handheld that featured 2 screens. It wasn't as graphically powerful or as sexy as the PlayStation Portable that Sony would be demoing on the show floor, but with its stylus, built-in microphone, touchscreen, and dual screens, it was clear that Nintendo was innovating in gameplay once again. It also had Wi-Fi, indicating that Nintendo was finally embracing the online gaming revolution. In addition, it would come out later that year, beating the PSP to stores. Mr. Iwata also made a few comments about its next generation console. It would, he said, revolutionize gaming. The console would be referred to as the Revolution for the next year, a more fitting name for the struggling company's next console perhaps than its eventual name. The pre-show press conference also had another surprise in store. A video began playing of a man in the distance on a horse. As he came closer, it became clear the man was Link himself. The game looked like everything the Wind Waker hadn't been. He was a mature adult Link. The crowd went wild. Then, Shigeru Miyamoto jumped out on stage with a sword and shield to standing ovation. Unfortunately, that would be all Nintendo showed off of the game that would eventually be called The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess at that E3. But it was enough. Everyone was talking about it. The Nintendo booth on the show floor also had a lot to offer. For the Game Boy Advance, Pokémon was back with Fire Red and Leaf Green. There was also the first true Zelda game for the handheld. The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap brought the new mechanic of changing the size of the game's hero to complete puzzles. And while Square Enix was still primarily making games for Sony platforms, it was now producing another Nintendo handheld game in Kingdom Hearts: Chain of Memories. The action RPG would link the events of the first 2 Kingdom Hearts games. Also playable on the show floor was Resident Evil 4 for GameCube, and the demo looked great. The gameplay of Leon wandering through a dark village full of zombie-like villagers was equal parts exciting and terrifying. People could barely believe that such a great-looking game was running entirely on Nintendo's GameCube hardware. Prince of Persia was back with a second iteration, as were Beautiful Joe and Paper Mario. Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, meanwhile, used the bongo controller to actually control Donkey Kong in a platformer. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes looked predictably great, and it was encouraging that storytelling elements would be brought to the fore. Attendees also had the opportunity to get their hands on the new DS. The machine was a bit clunky in the first iteration and looked less sleek than its eventual consumer version. The games on hand had been selected to show off the device's capabilities for gameplay and graphics. Super Mario 64 DS proved it had the hardware to run 3D adventures, while WarioWare introduced the many capabilities of touchscreen play. The one standout was Metroid Prime Hunters, which showed how the stylus could replace a mouse for shooting mechanics on a handheld. There was also a submarine game, little acknowledged, called Steel Diver. The game, it turned out, would never be released for the Nintendo DS. Instead, 7 years later, it would come out as a launch title for the 3DS.
My name is Iwata. I'm about making games. And I'm about playing games. Last night, I played Super Smash Bros. That's my game. I kicked some you-know-what. And I took his name. His name was Reggie. As Nintendo president, I'm also all about asking questions. So, Reggie, I have a question for you. Who's your daddy?
With E3 2004, Nintendo seriously reasserted themselves as a major player. With the 6th generation of home consoles winding down, it was clear Sony had won the console battle for now. And while Nintendo was down, they had shown they were anything but beaten. Microsoft, meanwhile, had proved itself a serious entrant, already building a loyal base of fans around some of its core series. Everyone was looking to see what the major manufacturers brought to E3 the next year, and speculation was rampant about Nintendo's revolution. The assumption that E3 2005 would be all about hardware turned out to be true. Sony was showing off the PlayStation 3, and Microsoft surprised everyone by announcing that their Xbox 360 would launch later that same year. Microsoft was showing some great content, including Gears of War and Project Gotham Racing 3, both of which looked fantastic on the new system. What Sony had on hand also looked very impressive, and it was clear Sony was going for the top-end tech. However, their system wasn't quite ready, and the boomerang-like controllers they showed off would never see a retail shelf. Sony had also just entered the handheld arena with the launch of their PlayStation Portable a few months before the conference, and their launch had looked promising for the company. The launch of the Nintendo DS had also gone smoothly, despite worries that the developers wouldn't know what to do with the device. By the time E3 rolled around again in LA, over 5 million units had been sold. It wasn't yet clear how that particular battle would shake out. Nintendo, not to be outdone by its rivals, did have some tidbits about the revolution to share. Firstly, it would be backwards compatible with GameCube games, and a virtual console system would allow play for even older Nintendo games from the N64, SNES, and NES. The physical casing was revealed, showing its small form factor. The controllers, however, were kept secret at that E3. Nintendo announced that new Mario and Zelda titles would be produced for it, as though anyone might have expected otherwise. Super Smash Bros. Brawl was also announced as a launch title. That announcement would prove to be premature. Metroid Prime 3 for the Revolution was also teased. The only hardware Nintendo had ready for launch was a bit of an oddity. The Game Boy Micro, a tiny version of the Game Boy Advance, was revealed for the first time. Perhaps Nintendo thought that small technology was the new fashion following in Apple's footsteps, but the interest in the device also proved to be tiny. The device would not be a success. With the Revolution set to launch the following year, E3 2005 was the last hurrah for the GameCube, and Nintendo brought out a slew of software. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was the star of the show. More gameplay was revealed, such as Link's transformation into a wolf and his travels into the Twilight Realm. Nintendo handed out the trailer to press conference attendees on Nintendo DS cartridges. They've since sold as collector's items for several $100s. Other GameCube games included Super Mario Strikers, Mario Party 7, and Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Nintendo would also finally get its first Dance Dance Revolution game. Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix featured remixed music from various Nintendo games and came bundled with a dance pad. The game even had a story set in the Mushroom Kingdom in which Mario had to defeat his foes in dance battles. There was also Nintendo Pennant Chase Ball, bringing the MLB to the GameCube. In an odd series of events, it would be quietly delayed and then cancelled despite being completed, and apparently quite good. The cancellation would herald the demise of licensed sport games on Nintendo consoles. The same fate would happen to StarCraft's Ghosts, a first-person shooter in Blizzard Entertainment's popular StarCraft world that, for whatever reason, would never see the light of day. On the DS side, there was Mario Kart DS, Sonic Rush, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, Mario and Luigi Partners in Time, and Animal Crossing DS. And with Nintendo trying to push the Game Boy Micro, the Game Boy Advance wasn't yet forgotten. Upcoming games shown that year include Mario Tennis Advance, Dynasty Warriors Advance, and Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. Overall, Nintendo's E3 was a perfectly adequate one, but their market share in this console generation had plummeted to third place, and their handheld dominance was now uncertain. With Sony and Microsoft's next generation offerings known quantities, all eyes would be on the revolution next year. For Nintendo, it was a do-or-die moment, but no one, save perhaps Satoru Iwata himself, could have anticipated just how much of a revolution Nintendo's next console would prove to be.